Hello and welcome back to the Faith Seeking Understanding podcast. I'm Roland. I pointed at you while I said that. I'm Roland. This is Matt. And we are busy looking at Ecclesiastes in the context of wisdom in the Old Testament. So we're going through Ecclesiastes. Last time we went through 7 verse 1 to 9 verse 11, which was looking at wisdom in relation to death and that kind of stuff. So we saw a lot there about how wisdom is good. But it's not where you find your happiness. It's where you, death makes it clear that it's not where you find your happiness. Yeah. And it needs to be guided rather by fear of the Lord, fear of God, and seen for the good that it is, but not overhyped, right?
I think we saw Qoheleth again underscore quite strongly the limited value of wisdom.
Yeah.
And it's valuable. Yes, it'll get you this far, but don't expect it to take you all the way. Don't expect it to take you further. There are going to be people who are stronger than you, and your wisdom isn't going to get you out of that mess.
Yeah. So this time around, he's still talking about wisdom. So remember, this is a projection of what we saw in the royal experiment in chapter 2. And so there he had two things to say about wisdom. The first was that the wise get what the fool deserves, namely death and being forgotten. And then he talks about how the fool gets what the wise deserves, right? Where in the example he uses is that the wise man works really hard with skill and labor and all these things, and then he dies and have to give it over to the fool who does none of that.
As you said that, like, you sort of paused after the wise man, and all I could think of builds his house upon the rock. My daughter has the song that she does in Sunday school that goes to that effect. Yeah. You sort of paused, and all I could think was builds his house upon the rock, and then you start talking about the work that he does. Like, oh.
Yeah. The wise man builds his house upon the rock. The fool doesn't. The fool's house gets destroyed, but then he inherits the wise man's house.
There we go.
There you go. And this is the problem, right? Like, if you think happiness is about being better off, and you're looking to be better off through wisdom, and the wise person isn't intrinsically better off than the fool, that's a problem. Like, you're not looking in the right place.
Yeah.
So just as we've seen in previous episodes, what Qoheleth is going to do is repeat some of that idea, expand upon it. This idea of what I call incongruity, where like the fool gets what the wise deserves. It's like, it's not how things should be. It's a very general term because really that's descriptive of the entire book. But I can't find a better description of it, so that's what we're going with.
Yeah.
So he's going through more examples of those. At the end of this section, he's going to commend his idea of fearing God, joyful toil in the fear of the Lord. But for the most part, in this section, it's probably the most disconnected section of all of them. So there is that through theme, whatever you want to call it, through line, thank you, of incongruity coming up in different ways. How like fools are often in the place of fools or people who shouldn't be in the place, like lower people are in the place of higher people, or where the wise should be. And he peppers in some advice every now and then if you don't try and find happiness in the pursuit of wisdom. Right. So that's what we're going to see. He starts off with what I think is a really great summary of this idea of incongruity, which is, again, I saw under the sun in 9 verse 11. We're looking at 9 verse 11 to 12 verse 8. So he says, again, I saw under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time, like a fish taken in an evil net, like birds who are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. Right? This is the basic idea. We're using the idea of time now that we saw earlier when we looked at chapter 3. It's not just about the duration of your life, but about just your life in general, like when you're living, right? And it's like you just don't know what context you're going to be thrown into. It doesn't follow the rules that it should. And this sort of undermines the pursuit of happiness, or of being better off through wisdom, because it's like, well, if things went according to the rule, the wise people would be better off. But things don't always go according to the rule. Yeah. Time and chance happen to them all. We just don't know what's happening. He goes through a bunch of examples about this. Sometimes, interestingly, I think part of what makes it so difficult is that sometimes chance or incongruity works in the favor of the wise, and sometimes it works against the wise.
Yeah.
So we see that in this first example that he has, where there's a poor man who's wise, and he's able, through his wisdom, is able to deliver a city from it being besieged by a foreign king. You're like, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And then he says, yet no one will remember that poor man. Yeah. It's like, you would think he would remember, but no, that's not going to happen. But then there's incongruity in the fact that this poor guy, who would have been looked down on in society, is able to deliver the city. And so it's like, okay, what's going on here? Like, this is crazy.
Yeah, but again, it underscores the point that he's already been making, that wisdom will only get you so far, and that what profit is there for a person in all their pursuits under the sun? Well, we can try approaching it from the angle of wisdom, but, well, even when it works, it doesn't really work. Yeah.
Depending
on the ends that you're setting it to.
Yeah. We see this idea again in the next verse. I love, like, 17 and 18 is just such an interesting little thing. He says, the words of the wise in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. So that you can think of, like, actually, whenever I read that, I think about Hitler. Because I always have this, because he did all those speeches where he would, like, shout and get, like, everyone rallied around him, and everyone's like, yeah, we're gonna do this, and it's like, think about what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's like, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so and then he says, wisdom is better than the weapons of war. Great. But one sinner destroys much good. So both have these disproportionate effects, and so it's sort of like you're just in this chaos of, like, what's going to happen? Who's going to, like, have the last say? And he continues that thought. I mean, you can see chapter 10, verse 1, dead flies make the previous ointment, give off a stench. So little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. But then he'll talk about, in verse 3, even the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and to everyone he looks like a fool. So, like, the fool is the person who digs the pit and falls into it, right? Or goes towards a serpent and he gets bitten. These are all examples you can use later.
Yeah.
The wise helps him to figure out, like, how to navigate those complicated situations. What's a clever thing to do? What's not a clever thing to do? But it's like,
better the person who has his eyes in his head. So in the royal experiment, he says, yeah, wisdom will get you so far. Like, it's better not to walk around in the dark.
Right.
But, yeah.
Yeah. And then, this is an example where he's expanding it in 10 verse 6. He says, folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Right? So that's just like another example. That's not necessarily wisdom or folly related, but it's just like, things just don't work like they're supposed to work.
Yeah.
And we could keep going, but I think the examples here that I'm sort of giving out, I think, make it clear that this is sort of like, he's just coming up with more and more examples of these, like, weird things where it just doesn't work how it should.
Yeah.
There's an interesting idea, like, later where they talk about, a wise man, in terms of speech, a wise man will know how to speak properly, and he can read the room and, say the right things and lead to the right conclusions, and the fool's words will consume him. Like, he'll make grand promises, or he'll say things that'll give away that he doesn't know what he's talking about, or something like that. But then at the same time, we see that kings often put fools in the place of advisors, rather than the wise men, because they won't chastise the king, and so they get elevated, even though in other times we know that the wise person is the one to listen to. And so it's just like, okay, like, what do we do about this? So this, I think, this particular section is quite interesting because he just goes all out. Like, in the previous sections, he's often given, like, a chunk, like a few sentences to one of the vignettes that he looks at. In this section, he's just like, and this thing, and this thing, and that thing, and that thing, and that thing, and that thing. So it just doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense anymore. Like,
yeah. Now just listing off examples for effect.
Yeah. It's so pervasive. It affects every aspect of life.
Yeah. I mean, you sort of see this in Hebrews as well, actually.
Oh, yeah?
He has Hebrews 11, you've got the Hall of Faith, where he's got this story, and then this story, and this figure, and this figure. And then we don't even have time to talk about Samson and Gideon and this person and that person and that person. It just starts, like, by the end, he's just mounting a case and being like, and. Almost like, I could go on, but you got the point.
You get the point, yeah, exactly. And so in all of this, we see, I think when you come out of it, if you try to read through it, I mean, it's not a very long section. If you just read through it, you kind of get the sense, like, he clearly thinks wisdom is good, but at the same time, it's not like this ironclad thing. It's not a silver bullet kind of thing. It's just like, use it when it's good to use it, or like to the extent that it's good to use it, but then sometimes just recognize that you're going to come up against a impenetrable situation, and that's just how it is, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is the same idea we saw before. The question now is like, okay, well, how do you live in this context? How do you, this feels like a very chaotic way that life goes, where things have disproportionate effects in ways that they shouldn't. And sort of like, well, what am I supposed to do then, right? And I think that chapter 11, it's actually quite interesting. It's not always does he have sort of up until now, he hasn't really had like most of his advice in one section. But it seems here he does. He just like kind of leaves his advice to the last section. People might have heard this phrase before, but cast your bread upon the waters, for you'll find it after many days. Give a portion to 7, or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth, right? Which is like, cast your bread upon the waters. Why would you do that, right? Like, I mean, we're not talking about like giving food to ducks or something. Like, that's not what we're doing here. Well, that's always what I think about. But he's basically saying like, give stuff a go, like. You know, like, see what happens. You don't know what's going to happen, you know, so sometimes it's worth taking a risk or just seeing what happens and then going for it. I think the give a portion to 7 or even to 8, that's sort of like, you know, it's kind of interesting. That's sort of a righteousness kind of vibe that you kind of get there, where it's like, yeah, give your money when, you know, like, not all of it, but like, give it away. Like, don't hoard it, because like, disaster will come and you won't get to enjoy it anyway. Yeah. You know, at least you spread some good, you know, like.
Yeah. I mean, by this point, he's already told some pretty depressing stories about people who tried to make these clever investments and found themselves, you know, without any of it to see for themselves. And give it away. Maybe you'll make some friends. Maybe you'll help people to look after you when things go wrong.
You don't know what you're thinking about this one thing, right? Like, best investments, all these sorts of things. But like, you don't know what's going to happen. Like, yeah, you could make friends. They could save you in a really tough time after all your investments go sour or something like that.
Yeah.
You don't know. No one knows. Just do it. Just see what happens, right? I love verse 3. 11 verse 3 says, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, but if you think about it, it's like, oh, the clouds don't stay how they are. They empty themselves out. And the tree stays where it is. So it's like, if you're looking to nature for a guidance of how this might work, it's like, nah. Sometimes it does what it's supposed to do. Sometimes it doesn't. You don't know. Yeah. Like, who knows?
There's this really interesting take from George Athas, who he wrote a really interesting paper on his proposal for the historical context of Ecclesiastes, which he puts in the Hellenistic period. And actually, at some points, he looks at some of the stories that Qoheleth tells, and is like, well, I mean, if we see this person as these characters over here, and this figure over here is that character over there, then actually we can map this onto some fairly specific historical events that give us a pretty good idea about when Qoheleth was writing in that time period. That's mainly in chapter 4 that he focuses, and we don't need to go into the specifics of his case. But given the politics and the empires that were sort of in the political game of the day, when Alexander the Great died, he didn't make clear which of his sons was supposed to inherit the kingdom, who was supposed to take over from it as his heir. And so you've got all of his different sons now thinking, it's me, I'm going to take it. I'm going to be the one in control. And so what was the mighty Greek empire that was the biggest takeover that the world had ever seen up until that point, if I'm not mistaken, became this really fractured kingdom with different sons of Alexander now vying for power and territory. And in this specific area, you've got the Seleucids in the north, and you've got the Ptolemies in the south, and they're both vying for power in this central region. And so you've got Jerusalem, where Qoheleth is, sort of caught in the crossfire between the enemies in the north and enemies in the south. And you still see allusions to this in Daniel 11 as well. And so his take is that here, and in a couple other places as well, when Qoheleth's talking about the south and the north, actually what's behind that is these political powers that are vying for control over the region.
Okay.
And so when he says that a tree falls to the north or to the south, that's where effectively Qoheleth is saying, whether it falls to the south, whether it falls to the north, we don't have control over that. So again, fitting into his bigger picture of things don't always go the way that we expect them to, that God's in control of them all, but actually we don't know what God might necessarily be doing, makes the case that, well, you know, whether it falls to the Seleucids or to the Ptolemies, you know,
So
that will fall, that'll be, go with it.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, as to your point about like it's up to God, I mean that's pretty much what he goes on to say, right?
Exactly.
Like, we don't know how this stuff works, and we don't know how the work of God, who makes everything. It's like, okay, so just like figure out what you can do while you have your life. So he does now go on to say like, you know, fear God in the days of your youth. Although, hang on, does he say? Yeah. So in verse 9, before he gets to chapter 12, he says like, okay, let me take a step back there. So verse 8 to 10 are like the closing thoughts before he gets to his like final conclusion over the whole section in chapter 12. And he says like, he kind of has this interesting thing where he says, you know, if a person lives long, like let him rejoice in them, because he doesn't know what's going to come. Like he doesn't know what's coming. So but you're kind of thinking like, oh, he says all that comes is hevel in verse 8, right? And so he's like, well, try then, while you can as a young man, to enjoy your life. You know, because you don't know what's going to come. It could be good, could be bad. It's like all random. It's all chance. From your perspective. He says, enjoy with your heart, you know, walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, but know that for all of these things, God will bring you into judgment. So he's, you know, still got this like fear of God aspect in mind, but like enjoy yourself. And then he's like, remove vexation from your heart and put away the pain of your body, for youth and the dawn of life are hevel. So even like the youth area is also hevel. Don't think like that's the key to being better off, is to have a good time when you're young. It's all hevel.
Yeah.
You know, like while you're young, try and make the best of it. Like you don't know what's going to come, but like realize even now, you don't know. You have no idea.
I mean, the analysis paralysis we were talking about in the previous episode, we're sort of talking about wisdom, and like you could sit there being overwise and find that you just don't make any decisions because you're busy analyzing every possibility. He says in verse 4, the one watching the wind doesn't plant, and the one who sees clouds doesn't harvest, because you don't know the way of the wind. You don't know what's coming. So get on with it, because your days are running out.
Yeah, totally.
Youth and vigor are elusive. Totally. You can't hold on to them.
And the idea of vexation is also connected to wisdom. When he tries to search out by things what to do with wisdom, the heart is full of vexation in chapter 1. It's the same idea. It's like if you try to do this, if you try to figure out what's going on, like as if there's some kind of rule that encompasses everything, like you're just going to be disappointed. So don't bother. Just do your best, like live a good life. I see actually, in verse 10, I don't know how you've translated it, but it says, mine says, and put away pain from your body, but I think it's actually put away evil from your body.
Discard vexation from your heart and let ill feelings pass out of your flesh.
Okay.
Because youth and vigor are elusive.
Okay. Yeah, it's like, just have a good time. Within the fear of God. So he still has, like, God's going to judge you. God's the one who makes everything. This was the basis for the fear of God in chapter 3. So, like, that's always going to be present there. But, he has been saying consistently since chapter 3, like, just enjoy what God gives you to do. Because, like, if you try and place it in predicting what's going to come next, you're just going to be disappointed. Like, it's going to be very bleak for you.
Yeah.
And so, then we have his closing words in chapter 12, verse 1 to 8, which start out kind of positive and then just
depressing.
Just very depressing. So I'll just read them for us. He says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I take no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the streets are shut, and the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of the song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are on the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Hevel of Hevel, says the Qoheleth. Everything is Hevel.
Hey.
Yeah. Very positive ending, but it is sort of like the things won't be good. So don't try, like, they're not necessarily going to be good. So don't try and, like, stake your happiness in that.
Yeah.
Rather, remember your Creator, enjoy things while you can, as a gift from him in the fear of God, and like take it day by day kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
Which is what he's been saying. But yeah, it's a very bleak way of concluding. I think it kind of speaks to the fact that like he doesn't see his solution as necessarily like I figured it out. It's like it's a necessary consequence of what reality is like. But he's not saying necessarily that you're going to be you're not going to be better off, right? Because he's rejected that way of approaching happiness.
Yeah.
You're going to be living life to its fullest, and sometimes it's going to suck, and sometimes it's going to be great, and like that's just how it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it very much does seem just make the most of it while you can. There was something else I was going to say.
It's done.
I've forgotten.
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite an interesting conclusion. I think it's interesting because in this section he doesn't actually speak about Hevel for a long time. For like 2 chapters, he just doesn't mention Hevel. Yeah. He goes through examples of what would be Hevel, but only towards the end does he actually start using the word again.
Yeah, well, he mentions in chapter 11, twice in chapter 11, he talks about Hevel.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't talk about it in chapter 10. He doesn't mention Hevel at all in chapter 10.
Mm-hmm.
And when he does talk about it in chapter 11, he talks about everything to come is elusive, and he talks about youth and vigor being elusive, and he already talks about it in chapter 12 until his conclusion, although arguably much of what he's saying there in chapter 12 is a reprise of some of the conclusions that he's already made. Yes, okay, cool. We're talking about like things shutting down and the bleak future but I mean, he's alluded to some of that already.
Yeah, I kind of see chapter 12, 1-8 as like the second conclusion. Like we saw in the Royal Experiment, those last few verses of chapter 2, where he's like, I guess we gotta do this thing, right? This is sort of his conclusion of the second, his like investigation since he started in chapter 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be nice if he just tied a bow on it, wouldn't it? Like he was like, yep, we figured it out. Don't worry, if you do this, everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
Like, no, I mean, I'm sorry, it's not. Like, that's just how it is.
Yeah.
The last bit then, it's not, so chapter 12 verse 8 is not the end of the book, right?
No, it's the end of Qoheleth's speech.
So right at the beginning, we had this like one verse at the beginning, which was like, these are the words of Qoheleth, whatever. And then Qoheleth started speaking.
Yeah.
And now Qoheleth like sort of gets off his soapbox, gives the mic back to the MC.
Yeah.
And the MC now, or the author, has his final words to say about things. And it's been quite interesting. I mean, if you read the literature, there's a lot of debate about whether the author and Qoheleth agree with each other. So a lot of the people who think that Qoheleth is a heretic of some kind, or like an example of who not to be, what not to be,
which, for the record, is not difficult to see. I mean, we've seen that he can be quite jarring at times.
Yeah, very grating in the things that he says. And they typically affirm that the author is orthodox. And he's saying, like, he basically gave Qoheleth the mic to show you that to kind of let him destroy himself.
Yeah.
And then, like, takes it over and gives his final few words.
Yeah.
What they've likened that to, I think, is the friends in Job, who say the wrong things, even though they're given a voice in the book.
Yeah.
I don't really like that because firstly the comparison isn't as apt as I think people think it is.
Yeah.
We're looking at 6 verses here at the end of this entire book. We're saying that's the orthodox, and the rest of it is unorthodox. That's the one aspect I don't like about it, just in terms of just from the start, I'm not a fan of that that amount of attention given.
Yeah. Sexually, you expect at least a little bit more engagement.
Right. So in Job, there's a lot of pushback from Job, right?
Yeah.
And then you also have a very clear-cut conclusion at the end, which is Job spoke rightly. God says Job spoke rightly. You guys didn't. Like, screw you.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't see anything like that here.
Yeah.
And then I think thirdly, like, I think in the course of this, we've seen Qoheleth pretty much say exactly what the author says.
Yeah.
So, fear God, take pleasure in what you're doing. Don't, trust in him. He will judge everything. We don't know how that judgment is going to work, but he will judge everything because there's a time for everything. And so, like, just bear that in mind kind of thing. And that's pretty much what the author says, particularly at the end, right? This is the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil.
It's perhaps also worth pointing out that the conclusion says that Qoheleth is a wise oak.
Right.
The teacher sought to find, or Qoheleth sought to find, in fact, a verse before, in addition to Qoheleth being a wise man, he constantly taught people knowledge. He weighed, explored, arranged many proverbs. Qoheleth sought to find delightful sayings and write words of truth accurately. That all sounds like, it sounds like he's quite the fan. Or that, at least thinks quite positively of Qoheleth. And then in verse 11 sort of does business with what we just pointed out, that sometimes he can be quite jarring. The sayings of the wise are like cattle prods, and those from masters of collections are firmly embedded nails. Like that, there's a sense in which, the truth is hard to hear. Sure, we might not have liked everything that Qoheleth had to say. It might not have always sat well with us, but actually, he's a realist. And sometimes the truth is just hard to hear.
Even this thing where he says, my son, in verse 12, my son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. That's kind of like what he was talking about with being overwise, right? Like you could keep looking at this and hope that you're going to get a different answer and then just like depress yourself. But at a certain point, you just be like, okay, yeah, I get what he's saying. Now I'm going to try to figure out how to live like that, and then move on with it.
I'll go and do it. Yeah.
So the question is, so they agree with each other. Are they different people?
So most people think they are. I think they're not.
You think they're the same person?
I think it's the same person.
Isn't it a bit weird though to pretend to be different people?
When you see that they actually agree with each other quite well, there doesn't seem to be any real obvious contradiction between them. It does seem like a bit of a strange thing to take a book that you disagree with and then write a conclusion to it and call the guy wise. Like it's the way the Stu Weeks puts it, like slapping a smiley badge onto a bomb. So the way that he opens it up to say this is what Qoheleth says, I actually wonder if maybe Qoheleth is a literary figure, that he wasn't taking somebody else's work, writing a title, writing a conclusion, partly also because this is no knockdown argument, but when I look at chapter 7 verse 27, then there doesn't seem to be much reason for the narrator to pipe up if he's just writing a conclusion to somebody else's work. Look at this I found, said Qoheleth, going from one thing to another, trying to find an explanation. What my soul continually sought, I didn't find. Okay, so there's this exclamation from Qoheleth saying like, I'm confused, guys. Why did the narrator have to pipe up there? Again, that's no knockdown argument. Many people, much cleverer than I, have looked at that verse and still thought that there were multiple people there. But it looks a bit odd to me that the narrator would feel the need to put something in the middle of a book that he had received. And I sort of wonder if he's taken Qoheleth as a sort of alias. Remembering something that we mentioned in a previous episode, that Qoheleth is the meaning of the Hebrew word Qoheleth is from the root kahal, which means to gather. And one of the things that we saw from Jenny Barber, she looks at the royal experiment particularly in the beginning. Other things too.
Which, by the way, is an example of putting on a persona, right? Like this person's not afraid of putting on personas.
Yeah.
Because he had that persona of the king in chapters 1 and 2 and then took that off in chapter 3 and then continued moving on to the next thing. Right?
Yeah. But in putting on that persona, yes, he was taking Solomon as sort of the centerpiece, is the key figure in Israel's history who was, paradigmatically wise, but also alluded to Hezekiah in some places, also alluded to David in some other places, and took a bunch of the kings and actually gathered them together. And then in chapter 3, by the time he's actually sort of taken off the kingly mask, looks through, again, something that we saw in one of our previous episodes, where he looks through the life and times of the nation of Israel when he goes through the different seasons that we go through, that there are little kind of tidbits there that cast our mind back to other events in the Old Testament to say that this is not as simple as different things happen at different times in a generic sense, but that we're recalling where we are in history, having looked back on the life and times of the nation of Israel. So all this to say that I think there's something that's quite deliberately being done here, to say, let me cast your mind through the lens of this particular character, through these different aspects and events and features of the Old Testament, brought together with our experience of things as it is. So, yeah, a very long way of saying that.
Yeah, I mean,
these are some of the strategies that he's taking to.
It kind of does make sense to do that if you're like supposed to be this measured guy, right? If you're trying to, and he does kind of take on that that stance when he says, like in 12 verse 12, like, my son, beware of anything beyond these. So he's trying to be caution and careful and all these things. But he needs to like convey a message which is just blunt and like harsh, and like you just need to hear this kind of thing. It kind of makes sense for him to put on a character to do that, right? Even though he's not disagreeing with it, he's not like, being a devil's advocate or anything like that. But it's just sort of the way that he does it is very brash and harsh and like, this is just how it is, like, deal with it kind of thing. I don't know, it kind of makes sense.
Perhaps given some of the more political aspects of it, of what he's had to say, and if George Athas is right that this is mapping onto particular events in particular times with particular people, there could be a sense of he gets nailed for saying certain things. Well, I didn't say it, Qoheleth did. I was just making up a story.
Yeah.
He's already sort of been like a little bit fast and loose with some of the details. There's a reason he didn't say, well, Joseph Tobias said this.
Yeah.
Like, right. He says, there was a man that I heard about.
Yeah. Everyone in the know knows what he's saying.
Let the reader understand.
Let the reader know. But it's like there's plausible deniability in that landscape.
So, yeah, given the consistency, I wonder if it was just one person rather than...
So we're like the opposite side of that like portion of scholarship that says these guys are completely, not only are they different, but they're like against each other.
Yes, yeah.
We're like within the sizable group that says, no, they agree with each other. And then we're saying, no, actually, they're probably even the same person.
Yeah.
It's difficult. Like, I agree. I think it makes sense. I never thought about it. To me, it's always a question of whether they agreed or not.
Yeah.
But I always kind of took for granted that they were different people.
I think that's the first question. Do they disagree or not? And perhaps the more important question. It is maybe worth just acknowledging that this is the minority position. That the vast, vast majority of scholars, whether they think that Qoheleth and the narrator agree, think that they're different people. The only people that I'm aware of that think that they're the same person is Michael Fox and Stuart Weeks.
Okay.
They come to a lot of very different conclusions all the way through the book.
Quite a lot, yeah.
But on this particular point, they're like, no. Qoheleth very plausibly seems to be just a literary creation of the author.
I mean, it does fit with how he behaves in the book, and then it also explains those like weird interjections in the middle of the book. So
yeah,
it's got some value to it. But cool, I think that's it. That's the end. Not only is it the end of Ecclesiastes, but it's the end of wisdom in the Old Testament for now.
Yeah.
I say for now because we'll probably come back at some point. But
yeah, there's every possibility.
Yeah.
We'll talk about this one.
I don't know what we're doing next. Have we decided? We've thrown different ideas.
We've thrown out some different ideas, but I think it might be too soon to say.
Okay. So you'll have to wait and see until the next episode. It might be a bit longer. It might not come out in 2 weeks' time. But it will come out at some point.
But in addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube, you might also want to follow us on our social media. So at FSU_South Africa.
It's in the description of everything. So it's in the description of the podcast episodes and the YouTube things. You can also go to our website, faithseekingunderstanding.co.za. It's all there as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for joining. See you in the next one.